Maybe that's a little bit better.
That's a touch better, mate. We've sexed it up a bit with that little
that's right.
bedside lamp.
That's right. Exactly. All right.
Exactly. So it's great to finally connect with you, and I've been a follower of your work for the past couple of years, Josh. Really loving the uncomfortable conversations you're having with a wide array of guests. So I guess I reached out to you via Twitter. This would have been several weeks ago, and this was on the back of a short video you posted, which apparently you received a lot of interest in, if not by way of DMs and whatnot, which is a video about Australia Day. And you basically said in this tweet, and I quote, "We can choose to hold two thoughts in our head at once: accountability for sins of the past, but also gratitude, humility, and pride of the glories and beauties of this vast island we call home." Of course, you're speaking of Australia, and the past sins that we're talking about are colonization. But this central idea, Josh, that perhaps we can hold two ideas in our heads at the same time, I mean, that essentially is fundamental to helping us make better decisions, build better relationships, produce good work. But it seems like so much of that is lacking today. Why do you think that is? And do you think this is getting worse by, as a product of the coalescence of, say, culture and technology and politics at the moment?
Yes, I mean, I think it's always been difficult not to be tribal. I think humans, we are tribal creatures. We're primates. We divide ourselves into groups. We have hierarchies. It's been that way for most of human history. I mean, I think it's easy for us in the modern world, especially in modern Western liberal democracies, to forget that this is a vanishingly brief period of time in which we have all been basically getting along and agreeing with the conceit that we need to navigate our differences through dialogue and consensus and democratic means. If you just threw a dart at a dartboard of human places and eras, in most times we have had the way of thinking that your peers had. And if there were other tribes that didn't agree with you because they had other religions or other ways of doing things or other notions of good or personhood or whatever, you'd go to fucking war with them, you rip them limb from limb. Like, that is the norm throughout most of human history. It's only since the Enlightenment, and I mean, if you want to take it further back, I suppose the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans who started coming up with the idea in the West, at least, of consensus and of consensus building. And I think that I do see at the moment a reversion to the mean, shall we say, where it's harder and harder for people to follow the thread of how important it is to be maximally generous to your opponents, to be maximally committed to a rambunctious and boisterous public square in which you have a lot of chaotic voices. And that's being tested by social media, because social media can be so disorienting and chaotic and can open up so many rabbit holes. And I'm sure we'll get to the question about what algorithms are doing to us and the siloing of people's beliefs and the fracturing of people's attention. So retaining that spirit of commitment to holding, I mean, in the quote that you just cited, you said holding two thoughts in our head at once. But of course, two is the minimum number that you want to hold at once. I think it's Anthony Robbins, the self-help guru, who says, if you ever find yourself choosing between two options, then you're not thinking hard enough. You should probably stop and take a breath and realize that there are more than two options to anything. And I feel a bit that way about the way that we think about politics and cultural and social issues. We tend to fall into binaries because it's our tribal warring primate tendency to do so. So we tend to think if you have pride in Australia, it means that you're doing an insufficiently good job of understanding the calamity that was that befell First Nations people. And if you feel guilty about what your forefathers did and acknowledge it as being a wrong that has not yet been rectified, then that means that you're taking a dump all over Western civilization and everything that a country like Australia has achieved. And of course, those are two absurd caricatures that very few people actually believe, but we find ourselves assuming that our opponents do believe one of those things. And partly, I think this is social media. Social media does have one aim, and that aim is to keep you on the site as long as possible so that it can deliver ads to you. And the way that it does that is by fostering engagement. And so it'll present you with things that are going to get you to either click on them or like them or share them or comment on them. And those things, by definition, are not namby-pamby, nuanced takes on, how we're all kind of right and we all need to see each other's point of view. They're likely to be things that either exaggerate the beliefs that you already have and reinforce them, or demonize the beliefs of people who you hate. That's what's going to get you tapping away and continue to be on the platform. So when you say, is it getting harder? I think it is getting harder. And I think social media is largely to blame, and the tsunami of information that's coming at us is to blame. But that, for me, is only more of a challenge to kind of realign ourselves with the precious legacy that we've been handed by the past couple of hundred years, or a couple of thousand years, if you want to expand the lens, of this experiment of trying to get along with each other in ways that accept that we don't cleave neatly into warring connections.
Absolutely, and I think right when it comes to the reversion to the mean, in the sense that we worked very hard to propel ourselves from tribal warfare, to get to those Enlightenment values a couple of hundred years ago. Obviously, taking us forward to, say, the Civil Rights Movement, and Martin Luther King Jr. saying we should judge people based on the content of their character, not on the color of their skin. But it seems like over the past, say, 10, maybe even 5 years, there has been that real reversion. And it was only 2010, 2011 when we really had this sort of coalescence of fast, cheap internet, cloud computing, mobile phones, which gave us effectively the proliferation of social media, Facebook, and shortly thereafter Instagram, and the rest is history now. And part of that also, I think, it's never been easier to create content. 20 years ago, it was hard. You needed access to, say, a studio of some kind. You needed distribution channels and things of that sort. Whereas now, anyone with a computer can basically be a podcaster, can be on YouTube putting out videos, can be tweeting away. And that massive content that's going out there just means that even if traditional, say, media outlets want to get noticed, and most private media outlets still have a business model, they have shareholders they're accountable to, they need to make money if they're private. But if you're competing with millions upon millions of content creators who don't have editorial, don't have any sort of due diligence process in place, they can just think something, create it, post it. It seems like there's all sorts of bad incentives in place for even traditional media to put out objective journalism nowadays.
Well, there's a lot there. I mean, let's talk about editorial processes and traditional media, and then remind me to talk about digital devices as well, and the invention of the like button, which is crucial to all this.
I think Jared Lanier was the. He was one of the. No, he didn't invent. I think he was one of the very vocal early. He was not.
He was there. He was in the room. I mean, he was
in the room, but he was against it, from what I understand. Yeah. So go on.
If people don't know Jaron Lanier, then we're checking out this crazy, like, big-haired, genius who was of all of this, and has subsequently become a major dissident in what social media is doing to us all. But it's interesting, Steve, that you mentioned editorial control and the ability of everybody to put anything out online. In one sense, of course, it's fantastic that we've democratized information, and that it now is possible for all kinds of people who wouldn't have had access to a platform in the past, who would have been held back by institutional gatekeepers, meaning producers and editors at mainstream news outlets, to produce whatever they want to and to find an audience. And on the whole, I think in the long run, that'll wind up being a good thing. But, the printing press was a good thing when Gutenberg invented it, but it led to 100 years of war on the European continent. So you go through some teething problems while you're getting from the invention of something into how you actually want to figure out how to use it. And I think a lot of people don't understand what happens in newsrooms. Like, I hear a lot of jadedness about mainstream media and the blind spots that the mainstream media has, the things it overlooks, the groupthink it can have, the political slant. I'm not talking about Fox News and MSNBC and Sky News After Dark in Australia. I'm talking about the New York Times and the Washington Post and the BBC and NPR and the ABC in Australia. And I've noticed a huge amount of an upswelling of distrust because of a certain leakiness and a certain unwillingness to tackle things that might be unpopular. I think COVID was terrible for this, and journalists were very much towing the line of public health authorities and not questioning whether or not it was initially true that you shouldn't wear a mask, and then all of a sudden it was true that you must wear a mask, not questioning whether or not it was absurd and racist to say that the virus leaked out of a lab, and then all of a sudden that was actually the most likely explanation. Now I don't even know what it is, whether or not it was true that there were cohorts of people for whom the vaccine was, on balance, perhaps not a desirable thing to be taking these mRNA vaccines if you had an alternative of going with a non-mRNA vaccine like AstraZeneca or Novavax later on. All kinds of things, opposition to lockdowns and so on, that people felt that the mainstream media was just getting wrong. And you can make exactly the same case about Black Lives Matter and the protests in 2020. The failure of the mainstream press to really question whether or not riots that were smashing up small businesses that were owned by largely people of color was really a vibrant expression of racial justice, or whether it also had overtones of mob, madness. So all these ways in which the kinds of people who work in media can elide things or miss things or see things through their own prism understandably frustrate people. But to make the case for journalism and the mainstream press, I don't think people understand how rigorously a lot of facts have to be fact-checked in these big institutions that have a long, multi-generational institutional memory and set of protocols about what you need to verify before you can publish them. I mean, I've seen journalists with huge stories, and the editor will come back to them and say, it's not there yet. You don't have it. We can't publish it. You've only got 2 sources for this. You need a third. And they'll go back and they will just beat the pavement until they find that extra person to really verify, until it's solid. I mean, look at Harvey Weinstein, for example. That was broken through sheer determination of the journalists who were investigating him. And there were all these institutions of power that didn't want that story to come to light. There was just no way that, an independent media person or Russell Brand in his house can do the kind of work that we need journalists to be doing. So there is no substitute for good journalism. And, it's not to say that good journalism can only take place in storied institutions of old, but the kind of investigative reporting that you need money and processes to pull off can be done in those institutions.
Are there, I suppose, political incentives in play to some degree, Josh, whereby, say, the New York Times, which it's known to lean left, may be more incentivized to report on certain stories over others, and perhaps perform sins of omission as opposed to sins of commission?
Yes, of course there is. Yeah, I mean, nothing's perfect, but you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to mix metaphors.
No, of course not. Of course not.
There's only so much speculation about the origins of COVID that Eric Weinstein can pull off on his podcast. At the end of the day, if the Chinese aren't going to open up the lab, then you run into some brick walls. But on the question of digital devices and where the ability to consume this information, I do think that what you were saying about everyone can produce their own content and this democratization of the media landscape. It's not just that everyone can produce content and that all that content can have the same kind of feel when you consume it as legit content. Your Twitter feed makes no differentiation between what something looks like when it comes from a newsroom of the BBC and what something looks like when Buttface44 tweets about it, right? So just psychologically, it's a little bit difficult to follow the thread of what's reliable and what's not, which is not to say that intellectually people don't understand the difference, but just culturally, it's not the way that we interact with the information. It's not just a problem of Buttface44 produces something and the BBC produces something, and we kind of, don't have a good way of differentiating emotionally between the gravitational pull of both of those stories. It's also coming back to what I was saying earlier about the algorithm, that these are not open fields on which you're just wandering through Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, receiving whatever it is that people might be posting. You're receiving the things that are reliably going to aggravate you or to reinforce what you already think. So there's a thumb on the scales in the sense of the algorithm. which will actually disincentivize a boring BBC story about nuance and turn the dial up on something that's likely to get you going.
Yeah, well, this is effectively the Dave Rubin effect, isn't it, Josh?
Right.
You're more or less incentivized to pander to a certain audience and put out certain types of content which are going to press those emotional buttons for your audience and get them liking and sharing and commenting and doing all that stuff.
Yeah, and it's something that I face, and it's something that you face. You have to be very, very careful not to avoid audience capture. I mean, in fact, you're talking about audience capture, which is a term for a creator intentionally veering, or maybe not intentionally, maybe unconsciously veering their content towards what seems to get the most of a rise out of their audience. I'm talking about something slightly different, which is that even between you've got Dave Rubin here, and then you've got someone who's making a lot more sense than Dave Rubin over here, Josh Szeps. And Dave Rubin is just necessarily going to be favored because it's clickier and stickier to be saying things batshit crazy than to be saying, well, on the one hand and then on the other hand. And
is that, sorry, Josh, just coming back to some of those fundamental human drivers, like Robert Sapolsky, the endocrinologist, basically, one thing he says is human beings effectively like to compartmentalize the world into neatly demarcated buckets because that helps them make sense of the world and navigate it in an easy way. Whereas, then that points to black and white content. Yes, no, right, wrong, as opposed to nuance and this messy gray in the middle, which doesn't make for a good 15-second reel on Instagram.
Yes, absolutely. It's that's another component. How long do people spend watching things? People used to sit down and watch Walter Cronkite talk at them for 30 full minutes. Who watches 30 minutes? I mean, I can't remember who said it. Someone said, at the moment, people only consume things that are either 15 seconds long or 3 hours long. They either listen to Joe Rogan or they watch TikTok. And nobody's doing something that's half an hour long.
It's wild, yeah.
But just before we leave the like button and the fact that we've got these supercomputers in our pockets now that are where we are constantly able to get little dopamine hits by opening it up and liking things and sharing things. That was not the original intent of social media. I mean, when Zuckerberg created Facebook as the pioneer of this industry, you had to open up your laptop and you had to type www.facebook.com and a browser would open up and you would get a reverse chronological feed of things that your friends were sharing. And it didn't matter whether the most recent thing that a friend shared was boring and unlikely to stimulate you. That would be the first thing you saw. And it was the invention, in addition to the like button, of the infinite scroll, so that it would never end. Like, you used to be able to scroll through Facebook and you would get to the end of Facebook. I mean, it almost sounds funny now, right? Like that you would finish Facebook, but you used to finish Facebook. That's it. That's all that is. Close the laptop. The idea that it would scroll infinitely, and if you got to the end of it, it would just find other stuff to populate you with, and that all of that stuff would be calculated to encourage you to engage with it and like it and so on. And the computer would then learn the kinds of things that you like, and the algorithm would get more and more sophisticated at knowing what gets a rise out of you. And then the placing of that into digital apps that go into phones in our pockets. I mean, how do you keep your head on straight and retain that sense of, all of us being part of a common demos where we have to be generous towards each other's beliefs? We've got this extremification machine constantly running in the background and you're stealing your attention every time you just want to take a dump.
Yeah. It's, there's a lot to unpack there. And part of it also, just going back to some of those, short attention spans, like you said, you're either watching 15-second videos on TikTok or listening to 3-hour podcasts. I was reading Gloria Mark's new book. It's called Attention Span. She's a professor of psychology at the University of California. And some of the tidbits that came out of that book, apparently shot length in films, for example, has reduced from about 20 seconds back in the 70s down to 2 seconds today because people need that constant engagement. And if you watch a lot of these sort of reels on Instagram and whatnot, again, you'll see that shot changing within, I think it's 1.5 seconds, because anything, say 3-4 seconds longer, people will just swipe to the next short. And I guess coming back to bringing this full circle back to mainstream media, traditional media, because this is the competition in a way. And so if people are kind of reduced to black and white thinking, clicking only on things that are simple to understand, clicking only on things that either make them feel wildly good or make them feel wildly bad. And you say are a head of say the New York Times, and you see your numbers dropping, they're dropping. You're losing clicks to independent journalists. You're losing clicks to Dave Rubin. You're losing clicks to people on Instagram and TikTok. What do you do? Because you've got to deliver a profit. You're an enterprise. It's your business model. And I guess that's what I'm partly concerned about, particularly with AI emerging, because the ability to create content is going to just boom 1,000x more when you can pump out a 500-word blog post in 2 minutes, thanks to a tool like, Copy AI, for example.
I think if you are a low-grade journalist writing factual news copy, or if you're the Daily Mail, which for people who don't know it, does no original reporting or almost no original reporting of their own, but is one of the most read news sites by stealing the stories of other news publications and rewriting them and throwing in a few tweets that they've been able to find about it and a few pictures and then reposting it. If you're that sort of thing, or if, for example, you're a publicist or writing press releases, then AI is going to eat your lunch really soon. And so the idea of there being a business model in simply writing, generic articles about stuff, that's dead in the water. So you're right. Those editors, they need to be constantly chasing the clicks as they spiral down the drain. But I do think things have changed in the past 5 years, and the boutique news institutions like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post have concluded that that's a fool's errand and that there's no point in chasing that because it's a losing game. And they've concluded, and I think rightly, that the only way to win is to produce more innovative content, more in-depth content. The New York Times was reasonably early in coming to the conclusion that a well-produced podcast would be a good thing to do. So they've got The Daily, which is very successful. They've got more interactive stuff, playing around with, interactive pictographic and videographic content, Brain or something. The New Yorker is doing well, The Atlantic, these kinds of publications that are really leaning into stuff that really only a human being is going to be able to do. It's possible that in the 2100s, computers will be able to write a New Yorker feature, but it's not going to happen anytime, that we need to worry about. That there is too much innovation and human creativity and originality that goes into those things. And so I worry less about that. Clickbait's going to clickbait, but clickbait only gets you so far, and there's going to be a law of diminishing returns there. And the people who produce good content are going to realize that there's more money to be made in quality, actually. And it's not true that people don't want it. They do.
Yeah. I think there is a segment of people that do want that content. People like yourself, people like myself, definitely want to seek out content like that. And there is an audience for that. And I think, I've run startup accelerators for the past 8 years. We've incubated almost 100 companies. And one thing you always tell an early stage entrepreneur is, how are you going to differentiate yourself? And in the case of the New York Times, as you've, articulated well there, well, you can't be doing what every other content creator, pumping out content with AI and whatnot, because that's a race to the bottom. It's a fool's errand. You need to be doing something different. You need to differentiate yourself on quality, and that's going to attract people who are after quality. So that makes a lot of sense. I'll leave the mainstream media stuff here because there's some other stuff I wanted to touch on today. But I think just more broadly speaking, when it comes to people having conversations out in society, more often than not, when, at least in my experience, depending on which social circles I'm running with, if I question someone else's position, far too often that person will take that as an attack on them, their character, as opposed to an opportunity to learn and perhaps update their position to be more in accordance with something that is a closer representation of the truth. Like John Maynard Keynes once said, I think it was, "When the facts change, I change my mind, sir. What do you do?" But it seems like that fundamental idea is being lost today, as in people just want to be right as opposed to get closer to the truth.
It's always been hard. I don't think it's ever easy. I think people are hardwired to feel like an attack on their cherished beliefs is an attack on them. It's always taken work. Again, it sounds cheesy to talk about the Enlightenment, but I think one of the great insights of Scottish philosophy, especially during the Enlightenment, was just this idea of epistemological humility and the need to constantly be sort of checking your own priors and conditionalizing your credences, meaning to sort of always be judging where the needle of probability lies on any particular proposition, and never jumping in, feet first into anything. This is the challenge of people of faith. I mean, people who are deeply religious have a level of certainty about things that it's quite obvious to everybody that nobody can have certainty about. So they usually know that on some level, that, if anything is certain, we know that we can't be certain about what happens after we die. I mean, that's just obvious. No one's ever been past and come back, as far as we know.
Well, depends who you talk to, Josh.
So you can claim to have certainty about that, but the means by which you derive such certainty is obviously fallacious, and you probably know it.
Absolutely. Just on faith, Josh, do you feel like, I suppose this is a conversation that's been broached by others in the ecosystem to some degree, but with all the tribalism that's going on and the tendency to latch on to the ideas and belief system of a segment of people wholesale and not really question any of those beliefs, we keep going back to the Enlightenment, but it was around that time that religion started to lose favor. As Nietzsche said, God is dead. And it seems like perhaps that the absence of religion in people's lives, that sense of meaning, community, perhaps has created a vacuum that maybe they're looking to fill with other things by identifying with anti-woke sentiment on one side and perhaps really woke ideology on the other.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. So also the sense that you're being embattled when someone is challenging your beliefs is part of this as well, what you were just talking about. The idea that if you try to help me to understand a way in which what I believe might be incorrect, I don't take that in a spirit of generosity. I'm likely to take that as an attack on me. This is also a fundamentally kind of religious and faith-based view of the world. And you see that as well in the split between woke and anti-woke. I mean, I'm not the first to make the analogy between wokeness and religion. John Mockwater's written a whole book about it. It's a very good one, basically saying the idea that we have an original sin, and that original sin is our whiteness and our complicity in white supremacy, and that it will never be absolved. But our lives are lives of struggle to recognize that sin and to rectify it in some way. And that by saying the correct words, almost like a catechism or a Hail Mary, by using the right words and not saying the wrong words, never mouthing the N word under any circumstances, it's almost like a Voldemort. This is, he says this is almost like if you stumbled upon a quote unquote primitive tribal community that had this ancestor's name that they couldn't say because they thought it would offend the gods. It's almost this kind of puritanical religious fervor that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Like, are we really not saying the N word when we're just talking about the existence of the word because we believe that the person we're talking to, if we're talking in private, is going to be so offended by it or so traumatized by it that we will have truly wronged them? Or are we playing along with essentially a bunch of religious style rules and codes of conduct? So that's quite clear. And in fact, I think there's an even further insight which I recently made on my podcast, Uncomfortable Conversations, with, I can't remember who the guest was, but I was noting that it was Tim Urban, who's brilliant, who has the Wait book.
30,000 word blog posts.
So good. Yeah.
Phenomenal.
We were talking about, Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist, has done a lot of work on the kinds of the core moral precepts that different people hold, which will be apparent in higher or lesser degrees in conservatives versus progressives. Conservatives are very concerned about purity. So if you think about purity versus impurity, and an opposition to like homosexuality and just sex in general is correlated with conservatives. Opposition to immigration, kind of these dirty people from outside our borders coming in and contaminating us. That's an obsession with purity as well. And it struck me that you see this among wokeness, that although the woke would always feel like they're on the opposite side of the moral spectrum to a xenophobe, when they are drawing a boundary around the good people and the bad people and tightly policing that boundary so that if you breach their standards, then you're out of it. That is a kind of a purity mindset. It's like we're gonna keep our insight into what it means to be a good person, which means to constantly be recognizing the ongoing reality of white supremacy and bigotry. And if you do anything that could transgress that by making the wrong joke or by treating women in a certain way or by, making light of race in some way, then we're going to put you on the outside. That is really the same moral compass fundamentally as the racist pastor who wants to make sure that black people or Mexicans don't come in and sully his congregation to some extent. I mean, you're motivated by a fundamentally exclusionary idea of trying to maintain your own pure order. And just because I've been pissing on the woke there, I should say there is also a hysterical anti-woke backlash. But I mean, it doesn't come from nowhere. The anti-woke backlash has become cynical and self-interested and censorious and crazy and disproportionately obsessed. But is it religious? I mean, it doesn't strike me as quite as puritanical and obsessed with rules. It seems more like a kind of a chaotic confusion, the anti-woke right, and a reactionary pushback than a puritanical religious movement.
Yeah. I think touching or double clicking on something you mentioned there, which was, there is this subplot, if you will, that people need to say the right thing, do the right thing, and organizations, movements, be they on the left or the right, want to maintain a sense of purity. And we saw several years ago now, James Damore, the software engineer at Google, he was promptly fired from Google for publishing a memo which looked at biological differences between males and females as one of the reasons why perhaps there are more men in tech than women. And of course, from what I understand, and I did have a cursory look at it, there was scientific evidence underpinning a lot of these findings. Whether or not the report was carried out in a way that would pass muster in an editorial backroom, I don't know. But essentially, he was fired for having a view that was contrary to the prevailing social narrative around diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Now, in whether it's corporate America or corporate Australia, we are seeing the massive proliferation of DEI movements, as well as affirmative action, diversity quotas and things of that sort, which I suppose tie into some of the woke ideology that we've kind of been touching on to some degree. And I totally understand arguments both for and against. Affirmative action to some degree will help reverse discrimination, help right historical wrongs, systemic injustices and things of that sort. But at the same token, when we elevate people to decisions of power based on anything other than merits, then we set that organization up potentially for failure because we have less than optimal people making decisions. We can create resentment. We can create an environment where people perhaps aren't incentivized to do hard work because they're like, well, I'm not the right gender, so what's the point? And things of that sort. So don't think I've really heard you touch on this topic too much on Uncomfortable Conversations. So I'd love to unpack where you stand on affirmative action and more so gender quotas, because it's something that I have heard so many executives that I'm aware of, both male, female, black, white, talk about privately in a way that they would never dare talk about publicly.
Yeah, I hear that a lot. I mean, I know a senior executive at a pharmaceutical company, a big international pharmaceutical company, who has reached a ceiling. There's very much a male glass ceiling, that white male glass ceiling now. The company has implemented such a robust gender quota system that in order to get to, I think they need 50-50 parity by 2028 or something like that. But because of when you run the numbers, it's not really possible for anybody in upper middle management to make it because it's so imbalanced at the moment. You're coming off such a bad historical base. such a male historical base. And in order to rectify that as quickly as the targets would require, there's no hope for anyone who's a white man. Now, I do understand the position that, like, well, white men have been ruling the roost for a very long time, so now it's our turn for a bit of discrimination. I don't really buy the morality of that, because it strikes me a bit like, I once had a conversation about eating meat with someone who was defending eating meat but not eating dogs. And just bear with me here. Like I was saying, I'm of the opinion that if you eat meat, you should be okay with, if you eat pigs, you should be okay with eating dogs. And I've eaten dogs in Southeast Asia. I don't think it's good, but I also don't think it's good to eat pigs. And this person was saying, no, we shouldn't eat dogs. And I was trying to say, why? Like, a pig is just as self-aware and just as capable of love and pain as a dog is. I mean, probably more. And they were saying, well, dogs have been man's best friend for thousands of years, so it's like a betrayal of the relationship. And I was saying, yeah, but for the individual dog, that doesn't matter. For the individual pig, that doesn't matter. Why are you torturing and then slaughtering a pig because that pig belongs to a group of sentient creatures who we historically don't have an allegiance with? Like, it's weird. Like, that's not the morality of punishing a pig and rewarding a dog because of this, like, historical relationship that our forebears had with their forebears. Doesn't make a lot of sense. Doesn't change the experience that the pig or the dog are having. So that may be a slightly tortured analogy, but I see this in somewhat the same light. It's not this pharmaceutical executive's fault that history has been unjust. So to whatever extent we can rectify those injustices with the deftest possible touch rather than the bluntest possible sledgehammer, I would be in favor of. Now, I mean, I'm in favor of affirmative action if you're coming off the back of a truly barbaric regime, as has been the case in the United States against African Americans and in Australia against Indigenous Australians. Then I think when you flick the switch, and it's not enough to just say, all right, are we all good now? We've been screwing you for 300 years and now we're just going to treat everybody equally. I think there is a role for tweaking the dial in favor of people who've been historically shat upon. Whether or not you get to that goal through the current ideology of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm completely unconvinced by, in the sense that when I listen to a Robin DiAngelo, lecture, it just doesn't seem to me to be motivated by anything like the principles that I regard as being civil rights principles. I mean, but my lodestar is always to ask myself, what would Martin Luther King and Gandhi and Nelson Mandela say in this situation? I mean, they have an attitude towards identity politics that was probably last best exemplified by President Obama, who is now regarded as being an old-fashioned, out-of-touch fuddy-duddy for talking about unity and how we can all get along, and there is no white America and there is no black America. I mean, the progressive sort of consensus is that that's naive, and that really, white people will always be racist and black people will always be shat upon, and therefore, sort of an aggressive attention to race is the path out of this. I think that's unlikely to succeed. I think it's likely to foment a backlash. It's likely to lead to the kind of tribalism that I said at the beginning of this interview has marked humankind in most places throughout most of time. And I don't think there's any way to get to equality other than through equality. But that having been said, I would still add that I would make exceptions in cases. It's all a question of degree. I would make exceptions in cases where a community has been horribly disenfranchised for so long. I mean, the other question here, which is very, very unpopular to say among progressive circles, is what's called the pipeline problem. There is generally a consensus on the left that if there is any disparity in the gender or racial composition of a particular group of people, CEOs or politicians, that is entirely explained by the bigotry of people who are doing the hiring. But the fact remains that, on my ABC radio show, I frequently have to speak with experts, and my producers literally have to fill out a diversity spreadsheet at the end of every day to map how well we're doing on gender, sexual, and racial disability diversity targets. And it is just the case that if I need to speak to the world's, greatest marine biologist into some sea slug, that person is unlikely to be a transgender Indigenous woman at this point in time. Maybe in 50 years, they'll be more represented in the sea slug biology departments. But right now, we're facing a pipeline problem of the historical discrimination and disadvantage has led to a situation where there are disproportionately more people of who have certain characteristics who are suitable for certain things. And sometimes that's intrinsic, like there just are more black people who are great at basketball and Chinese people who are great at violin and Jews who are great at maths or physics or whatever it might be. But I don't think you're going to get terribly far by insisting on perfect parity in all of those things until you have Jews being trained at basketball at the same rates that blacks are. So you've got as many good Jewish basketballers. There is some fields in which we don't have a big enough pool to be drawing from. So these are complicated, and I think the current hyper-progressive dogma is probably misguided because it is so aggressively focused on difference rather than unity. But that is not to say that I think that everything was peachy and we should go back to the 1950s, because of course there were horrendous institutional inhibitions on people's ability to achieve their full back then.
Appreciate your thoughts there, Josh. And I think on the Jewish basketballers, maybe once CRISPR-Cas9 is good enough and we'll get some gene editing going, we'll have some 7-foot Jewish basketballers suiting up for the Knicks.
Exactly.
So then all the practice and training in the world, Josh, I don't think it's going to make it much of a difference.
You may be right. I'll give it a shot.
We'll give it a shot, mate. With diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and I tend to agree that the current approach is probably going to create more of a backlash and all sorts of unforeseen downstream consequences that perhaps I find both ideologues on the left and the right tend to think of the world in terms of, say, first order of consequence. Well, we've got this problem. Let's do this. Let's just make it all parity and that'll be fine, without accounting for, well, how's that organization going to perform? Without accounting for, is this going to create resentment? Without accounting for, is this going to create sort of passive aggressive behaviors between men and women potentially, or men and people of color, like whatever the case is. And I think it's a difficult question. Going back to what we said earlier in the conversation, the messy gray, there's no one right answer to this. But one thing that perhaps isn't being spoken about enough is, well, what are the root causes? Like, why is this? And of course, there are many root causes. It's not one or two. There are root causes that go back to, colonialism, particularly with Indigenous Australians. But then there are root causes today that around, say, education and social factors and things of that sort that perhaps we need to be thinking more about in terms of how do we address those so that, the pipeline problem, as you call it, is to some degree rectified, rather than saying, well, we haven't got enough women in the pipeline. Let's just elevate some women who perhaps aren't qualified to take these roles that men would otherwise occupy.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of women, I think it's unlikely that they wouldn't be qualified. In the case
that's
of
just women, hypothetically speaking.
Yeah. It's harder when you're talking about small minorities because women are a majority of the population, so it's quite likely that that any position that a man can fill, there's an equally competent woman. Now, there may be lifestyle choices that disadvantage women in terms of the way that the work day is structured and the way that hiring managers look at your CV when you've been a stay-at-home mum for 8 years or whatever it might be. There are impediments there, but I think in general we should be shooting for parity, roughly between the sexes, in industries where there's no obvious preference, right? So I'm talking about politics and so on. But I do have some sympathy for this sort of hypothetical that Jordan Peterson popularized by saying, like, to want to be a CEO, you do have to be a bit of a psychopath. You do have to want to work 16-hour days is not a normal thing. And similarly, to want to be an engineer, it may just be you put 1,000 guys in a room together and you ask them, do you want to spend the day talking to a family that is having problems and trying to mediate their problems and coach them through them, or do you spend a day with this machine that's been broken, taking apart widgets and putting it back together again? You actually do get a different response if you ask 1,000 men and you ask 1,000 women. Women are likely to want to deal with human issues, and men are likely to want to deal with widgets. Now, that might be culturally, that might not be genetic, it might be a cultural thing, but it is the world that we currently live in. So to push for perfect gender parity in engineering and in family mediation would strike me as being, if that is true, as sort of pushing against what people's actual aspirations are and requiring them to do things that they're not actually ideally suited to necessarily. So if it's something like representation in Parliament, I think we should be shooting for roughly 50-50, because there's just no reason why women should be just as enthusiastic about and just as capable of figuring out solutions to the big problems that we have in the parliamentary setting. But if you're talking about an oil rig, or if you're talking about a daycare center, then there just may be natural differences of desire and and aptitude there, and try to iron them all out as a fool's errand.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not looking at gender parity in panel beaters and things of that sort.
That's right. Yeah. Well, that's another point that Jordan Peterson makes, isn't it? We're always talking about how why aren't there enough women in high-paid CEO roles, but we're never complaining about the lack of female garbage collectors.
Yeah. Absolutely. And just one final point on, I suppose we'll call it Woke Inc. Incidentally, the name of Vivek Ramaswamy's book on the topic, who's incidentally also running for president. As of last week, he announced he's running for president. But we have seen, I suppose, and Ricky Gervais alluded to this in his infamous Golden Globe speech, that organizations might do things to signal moral righteousness in a way, if you will. I may be misusing that word, but you'll have JP Morgan with an LGBTQIA plus flag over their logo on, say, LinkedIn. But then an organization of that ilk will have no issues selling toxic assets to, mom and pop who are barely making ends meet. Similarly, you'll have brands that do have such logo, filters over their logos, but at the same time will go off and sponsor the FIFA World Cup in Qatar, which, as we both know, was a very anti-LGBTQ World Cup. The NBA, obviously, very big on social justice activism in the United States. Black Lives Matter, got some very vocal spokesmen in terms of, the likes of LeBron James. But then when it comes to, say, Hong Kong, when it comes to, the Uyghur genocide in China, nothing to say about it, because that is a massive market for them. So it seems like there's a lot of hypocrisy going on when it comes to these quote unquote, woke corporations, but no one's really talking about that.
Yes. On one episode of Uncomfortable Conversations, my podcast, which people should subscribe to if they haven't
absolutely
already, I talked to the author. He's an Australian bloke, of a book called Woke Capitalism. And he's a leftist, and his critique is not the usual kind of right-wing thing of, these companies are going woke and it's political correctness gone mad. He's saying we shouldn't be yielding the territory of old school left-wing ideals, like of social justice and civil rights, to corporations, because they don't actually give a shit about them. And they're taking over terrain that rightly belongs in the public square, not in the private, not in private. You mentioned the rainbows all over everything that corporations put. For me, to go onto social media and see that Coca-Cola has a rainbow flag on their Twitter feed is completely meaningless when I can toggle over to the Saudi Coca-Cola feed and there's no rainbow flag. Yeah. If you're really committed to the cause, then instead of following what's popular, why don't you try to do it in an area, in a place that's not popular? When they start putting rainbow flag up on their Middle Eastern versions of their websites, then I'll give them some credit. But what they're actually just doing is following whatever the fashionable cause happens to be in the particular places where they are. When they start putting Allah up on, in Israel on their sites, then I'll have some more credibility. At least I'll believe that they actually believe in the thing that they're proposing. Otherwise, it's crass. It's hypocritical. I'm not naive, so I know that companies are always going to behave like sociopaths. That's just they're always going to go for the bottom line. So I don't think there's anything necessarily that hypocritical about them doing terrible things around the world. I don't go to corporations, to global corporations, to get my ethics. I think it should be transparent to all of us that when they try to do social justice and put their brands behind this, it's pure cynicism.
Yeah, absolutely is. With the time that we have left, I wanted to touch on one final point, which is, you're what, in your early 40s, mid 40s, Josh? Yeah, I'm 39, 40 this year, Generation Y, Generation X, that sort of age group. But there are subsequent generations, of course, coming through, Gen Z, which to large degrees, they've been raised with these devices that we talked about in their hands. Many of them have adopted certain views wholesale from a young age. And Jonathan Haidt spoke about this concept of safetyism in his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, which he basically said is leading to a decline in resilience and the ability to tolerate opposing viewpoints, right? Now, in terms of these kids coming through, they're coming through by institutions, schools, whereby they might be getting indoctrinated into certain ways of thinking. Now, I understand that the jury's still out on this. We hear anecdotal things. When I speak to my niece, who's 15 years old, coming through a public school, I'm like, what are they teaching? Are they teaching you this type of stuff? She basically says no when it comes to certain, woke ideology that might be getting incorporated into the curriculum in some way. But, my fear is that perhaps in 10 years, 15 years, there is just a greater proportion of people in positions of power that have these views whereby we are completely shutting down discourse, and just that puritanical sort of thing you were talking about earlier, that becomes the status quo. And we have fewer people fighting to bring us back to some of those values of reason that perhaps go back to the Roman and Greek empires of 2,000, 2 millennia ago. So, what role do you think institutions play in helping to address some of this, crisis of critical thinking, if you will, in society?
Well, it's going to be a big fight. This is the battle. I think this is the battle of our age. The left is distracted with an obsession with its purity tests over social justice, but I think the real battle will be to keep alive the flame of liberalism. Look, I'm actually kind of optimistic. I think millennials are the craziest ones, like the youngest millennials who were the first people growing up with digital devices. And I guess the older Gen Z, I'm worried about. But actually, I think that younger people are going to sort it out. I'm reasonably optimistic that they will just become sufficiently slapped in the face by reality that they can't follow the fads the way that the people who are 15 years older than them have. I hope that there'll be certain purity tests that are good. Things will change in ways, there will be things that we can't say in 20 years that we say freely now, which is probably good that we don't say in polite company. Just look back at the way that even newspapers wrote about women or black people in the 1950s, let alone the 1920s. And it's shocking. And it's a good thing that we live in a world in which those things can't be said without you being fired or, sent packing from the party that you happen to be at. And so to the extent that we can advance the kind of needle of progress of humanity and empathy, that's great. To the extent that bleeds over into hysterical purity tests and, piling on with kind of mobs with flaming torches on anyone who happens to trigger a particular tripwire that you just set up 3 seconds ago, that's going to be terrible. But I think we've probably reached the peak of tolerating that kind of cancel culture. Yeah. And I think young people are likely to be more commonsensical about it. And I think the one thing that has to change is that social media companies cannot keep using algorithms this way to make money. The time you spend on the site can't be the only yardstick for how they fund themselves. You know, we have to end up having a more mature understanding of the economics of how we want these things to work. We have to reclaim our attention so it's not fractured by these extremification machines. And we have to just keep preaching the gospel, so to speak, of reason and extending to your opponents as much empathy as possible, and of trying to have faith in the public square rather than in your little tribe. Those things can be true or more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think if you zoom out far enough, the pendulum always swings, from left to right and back again. And if you're living in the GDR back in the 1970s, you may have been all in on this sort of collectivist utopia, but once you were waiting in line 5 hours for a potato, perhaps you started having second thoughts, right? So, let's throw in 1 minute. I'll give you 1 minute, Josh, rather, for a first date question before we wrap up. I know you love your first date questions, so I've written one exclusively for you. Right. If you could ask any dead person a question to help make sense of today's socio-political climate, who would it be and what would you ask?
It's a really interesting question. I would probably ask Abraham Lincoln, why did you do it?
Free emancipation?
Why did you emancipate the slaves? Mm-hmm. Because I think his answer would probably be full of a lot of insights about our common humanity and the way in which our common humanity smacks into the lived reality of politics and compromise.
That's a beautiful place to end this conversation, Josh. So if people want to get more of Josh Szeps, more of the, what did you call it? The Church of Szeps, they can sign up at uncomfortableconversations.substack.com. And right now, you can get Josh's premium content for free. So get onto that Substack. There'll be links in the show notes to both the Substack as well as the podcast on Spotify. And if you'd like to follow Josh on Twitter, you can do so at Josh Szeps. That's Zepps, like Led Zeppelin, although his surname is spelled SZEPS. So just clarifying.
It's confusing. But if you Google Uncomfortable Conversations, just sign up to that on any podcast app, and that's probably the easiest entry point.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for your time, Josh. Hope you have an amazing evening.
Lovely to talk to you.